The original Ni no Kuni gained a ton of hype and attention due to its partnership with the legendary animation studio, Studio Ghibli. It was a complete JRPG package excelling in visual design, music, and animation. Unsurprisingly, it was a massive commercial success as well. Nearly a decade later, Level 5 Studios is finally releasing the long-awaited sequel. Though the game is no longer officially partnered with Ghibli, the same animators, designers, and composers who worked on the original have returned to work on Revenant Kingdom. Can Ni no Kuni II provide an unforgettable JRPG experience? Let's find out. Perhaps one of the most alluring aspects of Ni no Kuni is its visual style. It's no surprise that Ghibli's influence over the game's aesthetic direction remains in the sequel, and right from the start, you'll get a taste of the wonderfully animated cutscenes that dominate the storytelling of the game. One thing that I have to praise Level 5 for is the cohesiveness of the art styles. The transitions from the pre-rendered cutscenes to the actual playable sequences is almost seamless because of how identical the cinematic graphics are to the in-game ones. If it weren't for some of the poorly done audio transitions that abruptly cut off the music rather than cross-fading between scenes, the transitions would be perfect. The stunning visual work extends to the character animation and combat effects as well. During an encounter, you'll be greeted with smooth animations paired with explosive particle effects that really make the encounter feel impactful and responsive. For these reasons, as well as a few others, combat is easily the best part of the game, but more on that later. In Revenant Kingdom, you'll be traversing a multitude of different environments and settings, from Oriental-inspired cities to steampunk fortresses, each featuring unique color palettes, architectural design, and sound. The orchestral soundtrack is what really brings each of the locations to life. Aside from the transitional hiccups, the actual score itself is mesmerizing. Each area has a self-defining theme that really contributes to the uniqueness of their design. Take for example Hydropolis, an island city surrounded by a vast ocean. Upon arrival, you'll be greeted with a mysterious melody that is simultaneously majestic as it is melancholic. I think it matches wonderfully with the scenery of the oceanic city, but it also functions to complement the backstory behind the city. All in all, Ni no Kuni does a fantastic job at creating a gorgeously atmospheric world that is just a joy to play in. But what good is a beautiful world if it didn't have a story to give it life? In Ni no Kuni II, you take on the role of young King Evan in his attempt to build a new kingdom after being overthrown from his homeland of Ding Dong Dell. Though the story starts off slow and the writing is honestly shallow at times, it does pick up a few chapters in. If you're familiar with the JRPG franchises in general, I don't think the plot structure will catch you by surprise. It follows a very generic JRPG path, but that isn't to say that the story isn't interesting. It can just get a bit predictable at times. Think of something like the Final Fantasy franchise. Practically every game revolves around the protagonist traveling to various lands to cleanse 4 or 5 crystals or something similar. But each area has its own major plotline, dungeons, and intricacies that make each game unique. Ni no Kuni is similar in that regard. The overall path is predictable, but the details are not. If you think that because of the bright visuals and the cartoonish graphics that the game shies away from any type of mature theme, then you'd be mistaken. Although the initial premise of Evan's dream may be childish, the stories told and the lessons learned throughout his travels reflect a more serious tone. From the loss of loved ones to political corruption, these are problems that help shape Evan into the ruler he is to become. However, I must admit that the writers could have gone much more in-depth with the themes of the major storylines, but refrained from doing so. Maybe this was done in order to be more inclusive of their younger audience, but I felt like this was a missed opportunity. And while we're on the topic of missed opportunities, the game features an interesting cast of main characters that I think were designed very well, at least visually. The problem is that aside from Evan, practically none of the supporting characters develop in any way at all. From the time you meet them until the end of the game, they're really just there to provide supporting dialogue that is shallow to say the least. You don't really go into any of their backstories, they don't have personal issues, there's no conflict, and everything is just stagnant. Having such surface level characters really damaged the depth of the story for me, and it was honestly a bit disappointing. But what really redeems the game is the fantastic combat system. It's actually very simple on the surface, but they do it right and they do it well. Each character has 4 active skills that you can use. Along with that, you have an arsenal of 3 melee and 1 ranged weapons that can be swapped seamlessly. The purpose of having multiple weapons is to power up the Zing gauge, which upon filling up, passively alters one of your skills. The game offers a couple of modes that control when your weapon swaps. I just left mine at the default semi-automatic mode and it worked fine for me throughout the game. Range attacks are bound to a separate button which enables instantaneous firing, and that lets you weave range attacks in between melee strikes if you need to kite. Since it doesn't actually swap out your weapon per se, it feels much more like activating a skill. It's well done and it feels great. As I mentioned before, the graphics and the animation really bring out the best of the combat experience, and it looks good too. You may have noticed these little spirit-like entities running around the battlefield. These are known as Higgledies. They are elemental spirits that aid you both during combat and outside of combat. You can have a total of 4 different Higgledies in your party at any given moment, and there's a ton of them you can craft or collect. Each Higgledy has its own set of passive and active skills, so you'll have the option of choosing the ones that complement your playstyle. When their abilities are ready to be used, a circle lights up beneath them during combat. Simply walk over and activate their skills. These abilities range from healing to dealing AoE damage to summoning cannons. Between your party members and Higgledies, you've already got a pretty fun and exciting combat system, and in all honesty, it's more power than you'll need to easily complete the game. But there's one more element of combat to talk about, and that's your Kingsmaker, Lofty. Without getting into any spoilers, Lofty is another companion that joins you and your party in combat. Rather than directly influencing combat, Lofty gives you passive buffs, most notably the Golden Orb. When you touch this golden orb, your character becomes awakened. All your abilities are supercharged and require no mana to use. This means that during your awakened state, you're able to spam all your empowered abilities as much as you want. It's insanely powerful, and it's often enough to end fights quickly, with the exception of boss battles. I absolutely love Ni no Kuni's combat system. It's just very well polished and super fun to play. But there is one big problem that I have with it. For all the tools that they give you in combat, the fighting itself is way too easy, especially in the early parts of the game. You'll be dispatching enemies multiple levels above you without breaking a sweat, and it really takes away from not just the combat experience, but the overall game experience as well. It just isn't challenging. Though it does get a tad more difficult halfway through the game, it's still very easy if you're paying any attention to the combat at all. The only exceptions are the chapter boss fights and the tainted monsters, which are open world mini bosses you'll sometimes encounter. The boss fights are engaging, feel epic, and forces you to use all the resources you have at your disposal. But even so, I never found myself needing more than one attempt to down them. This is my single biggest complaint of the game. It's just too easy. Moving on from combat, we have the kingdom building portion of the game. As someone who really enjoys simulation and base building games, I was pretty excited to test this out. In short, I think they created a decent complementary system to the rest of the game. You're not going to find a super in-depth simulation game here, but something that is just simple enough that you won't be spending a lot of time figuring out how things work, and in-depth enough that it fills the fantasy of the kingdom building. From clearing the land to building your first structures to recruiting individual citizens, it really plays into the storyline of rebuilding a new kingdom from the ground up. You're not simply just hearing the dialogue and having things happen behind the scenes, you can actually see the progress of your kingdom and have it grow into a thriving country that can assist you in your quest in a variety of ways. You start off with your main castle that generates passive income known as King's Guilders, and that's specifically used in your kingdom. With this currency, you can construct buildings that will let you craft items, upgrade spells, gather materials, cook food, and much more. If you're not into this kind of thing, the good news is that it's optional for the most part. There are a couple of instances where you're required to have certain improvements completed in your kingdom to progress through the main story, but other than that, the rest is completely optional. Speaking of optional gameplay, skirmishes are one part of the game that I'm glad it's entirely optional. These skirmishes are Ni no Kuni's attempt to create large-scale battles between armies. Though the idea of having certain citizens lead platoons of soldiers into battle sounds cool in theory, the execution feels like kind of an afterthought. You can control up to 4 platoons in any battle, but you're limited to just rotating their position in a circle and activating a specific platoon skill. Most of the time, you'll find yourself just running forward into enemies and making sure your melee units are in the front. There's practically no strategy to it, and I personally avoided these battles altogether. The only time you're required to do these battles are for certain side quests, which I chose to skip. Ni no Kuni II Revenant Kingdoms is in no way a perfect JRPG, but as an overall package, the game delivers on a fantastic core experience. From Ghibli's visual DNA to wonderfully fluid combat, Revenant Kingdom solidifies itself as a JRPG franchise. I would wholeheartedly recommend this to any JRPG fan. Just be wary that this isn't a particularly difficult title, and if you're looking for something with strong character development and a deep story, this might not fit you well. Thank you guys for watching, and if you liked my review, hit that thumbs up as it really helps the channel out. If you loved the video, hit that notification bell and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on my future reviews. If you have any questions about the game, leave them in the comments below and I'll try to answer them. That's it from me, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.